those new to the center, the Woodrow Wilson Center was established by an act of Congress in 1968. It's the nation's official memorial to our 28th president. It is a nonpartisan institute for advanced study and a neutral forum for open, serious, and informed dialogue of the kind we're sponsoring today. Today's program is brought to you by the Environmental Change and Security Program. On behalf of my colleague Jeff DeBelko, director of that program, who can't be with us today, I want to say that we are honored to welcome back the Right Honorable Hilary Benn to the Center as he speaks about confronting the crisis of sustainability and resource scarcity. Mr. Benn is the UK Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. He's a member of Parliament representing Leeds. Previously, he was Director of the Department for International Development, or DFID. More information about Mr. Benn is available in the handout. He was here just a year ago, a little less, for an event sponsored by the Environmental Change and Security Program to meet with a group of experts to examine the complex linkages between climate change and security. We welcome him back today to draw our attention to the critical issue of resource scarcity during a crisis of sustainability with respect to food, water, ecosystems, and demographic growth. One last note before we begin. This event is being webcast, so please turn off your cell phones so they don't interfere with our audio system. And during the discussion segment following Mr. Benn's speech, please wait for a microphone before asking your question. With that, it's my pleasure to welcome Hilary Benn to the Woodrow Wilson Center.
Well, Rob, thank you very much indeed. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to be back here at this centre that honours the memory of Woodrow Wilson, of course, the 28th President of the United States. He was, of course, known the world over for his commitment to peace and to justice, the great causes for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize. He was an internationalist, and his vision helped to reorder the world, and it still guides the politics of Europe today. And it is about the great threat to peace and justice in our age that I principally want to talk about today. Now, President Wilson himself was very alive to this threat. In his inaugural address that was delivered 96 years ago, he listed what he described, I think it's a great phrase, the things that ought to be altered. And among the chief items were, and I quote, an industrial system which exploits without renewing or conserving the natural resources of the country, a body of agricultural activities not served as it should be by science, watercourses undeveloped, waste places unreclaimed, forests untended, fast disappearing without plan or prospect of renewal. Now, his was a litany of environmental degradation. In a country studied in the techniques of production, but casual about its costs. Same true for a lot of countries in the world. Now, a century on, our world has changed, and in many ways for the better. And yet these problems persist, deepened over the years by the very forces that Wilson himself identified. And the consequence is that we are today faced with a crisis of sustainability. The most glaring threat is that of dangerous climate change. But it's not the only example of the problems we create when we exploit the world's resources unsustainably. The spiralling price of food in 2008 was a wake-up call. Riots threatened political stability. Export bans threatened world trade. Wheat prices doubled. Rice quadrupled. And another 75 million people were threatened by poverty and hunger in a world in which 1 billion people are overweight and another billion go to bed hungry every single night. Josette Sheeran of the World Food Programme, and her organisation was priced out of buying food in the open market, called it a silent tsunami. I think she was right. And although prices may have fallen back today, the problem hasn't gone away. Demand is growing and global food production will need to double by the middle of the century to meet it. And that means there's going to be more pressure on land and more pressure on water, the two things that we need to grow food. We are already seeing a new Klondike scramble as potentially food-poor but income-rich countries rush to secure fertile farmland in Africa and across the developing world. They probably remember Mark Twain's wise advice to buy land because they're not making it anymore. Private companies and countries, China, Japan, Saudi Arabia and many others, have been doing just that. And I understand you were discussing this at your land grab conference just a week or so ago. Millions of hectares of earth are changing hands. Now, in the past, increased agricultural yields have fed the world and eased the pressure on land. And Norman Borlaug, the man who more than anyone else revolutionized agriculture in the developing world, pointed out that if yields had stayed where they were in 1950, then by the start of this century, we would have needed an extra 1.8 billion hectares of land to grow the same amount of grain. Now that's an area roughly the size of South America. We don't have any more land. So while we need a new agricultural revolution, we also know that the intensive production of the last one did not come without a cost. So this time, the increase in global production must be achieved in a way that is environmentally sustainable. The expansion of biofuels to the detriment of food production and vulnerable ecosystems is an example of where we can get the balance wrong. But it's not just land that we need to produce food, it's water too. And we need to start recognizing just how valuable and precious this stuff is. A third of the world's population is today living in places where water is scarce. A third. By 2025, it will be 2/3. Lake Chad provides water for about 20 million people across 4 countries. In the 1960s, the surface area of Lake Chad was 25 square kilometres. Today, it's less than 1,500. When I visited the Mian Reservoir last November, it's about 2 hours' drive northeast of Beijing, I learned that this is the main supply of drinking water for the capital. It can sustain about 10 million people. It's now struggling to provide water to closer to 18 million people. And over the last decade, water levels in the reservoir have sunk lower and lower and lower. What was 4 billion cubic metres of water is now down to 1 billion cubic metres of water, and it's not being properly replenished. So the Chinese government has acted. They're planting forests on the catchment around the lake to act as a sponge, to capture the water that would previously have run off the eroded soil and evaporated. They're paying farmers to change from rice to less water-intensive crops. And they're now building a canal to divert part of the Yangtze River by almost 1,000 miles. It's rather like pumping water from here to Texas. Across the world, people are now recognizing just how precious our resources are. Stephen Chu, your new energy secretary, has issued a stark warning that California, which, as you know, currently produces about half America's vegetables, could become an agriculture-free state by the end of the century because there simply won't be enough water available. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, sees an even greater risk. At this year's World Economic Forum, he said, "The challenge of securing safe and plentiful water for all is one of the most daunting challenges faced by the world today. Too often where we need water, we find guns instead." Take the terrible conflict in Darfur. It's been made worse by extended droughts as pastoral farmers clash in their search for food. And what are we going to do when human beings start to fight each other, not about their politics, their religion, or about land, but fight about water? The truth is, these threats are real, they're immediate, and they will affect us all. Environmental degradation is putting an increasing strain on our natural resources, and it is both a cause and an effect of climate change. So in this year of Copenhagen, the most important gathering in human history, in my view, an agreement on cutting emissions would be the biggest single step that we could take to safeguard these resources. And yet, even such an agreement will not, indeed cannot, encompass all of the things that we need to do to safeguard our environment. And the most difficult task we face is how to reconcile reducing emissions with reducing poverty. In other words, the need for more development. Now, many developing countries are already faced with the stark reality of environmental degradation. Take Haiti. Massive deforestation has left the country vulnerable to devastating floods. Its watercourses are polluted, they're laden with sediment. Almost 90% of the children of Haiti are chronically infested with intestinal parasites from the dirty water they have no choice but to drink. 90%. It's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and its overexploited environment is now bankrupt as well. As Franklin D. Roosevelt once remarked, a nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. Now, Haiti may be an extreme example, but it shows the urgency of the problem and the necessity to match action on climate change with action on environmental degradation. Those countries that may in the past have regarded worrying about the environment, well, that's a luxury for the wealthy, are now becoming aware that they and we need to do something. Why? Because the destruction of ecosystems and the loss of biodiversity is a problem the world over. The Millennium Assessment showed us that 60% of our ecosystems are being degraded or being used unsustainably. And so, 2 years ago, at a meeting of the G8+5 in Potsdam, an initiative was taken to try and transform the debate about natural resources, just as Nick Stern has done on climate change with his groundbreaking report. And the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity project, led by Pavan Sukhdev, is now taking forward some remarkable work. We all value the natural environment for its beauty. It's part of who we are. It nourishes our souls. But this project is seeking to define the economic value of what nature provides. The food, the fibres, the fertile soils, the carbon storage, much of which our markets take for granted. Now, there is a different way of seeing nature. People are already paying for the services it can provide. In Brazil, communities in forested areas are being paid for their eco-services in helping to preserve the trees. In China, they're paying farmers to change their crops in order to improve the soil. And closer to home, my home in the European Union, we already make payments to farmers for what we call environmental stewardship, ensuring that they farm in an environmentally sensitive way and recognising the public benefits that they provide. Thomas Friedman talks about two ecosystems, the policies, the investments and the people that it will take to save the plants, the animals and the forests. And he envisages conservation projects around the world run by local people, providing jobs that enable communities to thrive without exploiting the local environment, creating what he describes as 1 million Noahs and 1 million arks. Now that's the aim of the UK's Darwin Initiative, working with countries that are rich in biodiversity but unable to provide the money to protect it. To date, we've funded over 670 projects in more than 140 countries. We're supporting the Congo Basin Forest Fund. We're seeking to halt the entry of illegally logged timber into the European Union market. We're pushing for an effective agreement on preserving forests at Copenhagen. And because we cannot count what we cannot measure, we need the help of science, just as we have had on climate change. And that's why we're strongly supporting the establishment of a new intergovernmental science body on ecosystems and biodiversity to undertake a similar role to that of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And US support for this will be vital. Now, there is, of course, another cause of resource scarcity, and that is increasing demand. By 2050, there will probably be over 9 billion of us living on this small and fragile planet of ours. So, of course, it prompts the question, can we provide the resources, the food, the water, the energy, to sustain the equivalent of another 2 Chinas? And it may seem strange in the midst of a global recession, but prosperity is rising in parts of the developing world. And this new middle class is a willing consumer. Demand for meat and for dairy products is increasing as the Western way of eating becomes the latest export. In developing countries, it's set to rise by about a quarter in the next 10 years. And there is seemingly a contradiction here. Development is the best way of lowering the rate of population growth. We know that. And so, in turn, lowering the pressure on resources. But development also increases income and therefore demand. And the way out is to create a green economy for developing and developed nations alike that is truly sustainable and equips us for the long-term problems we face. So what needs doing? Well, I think the first task is simply to recognise this truth. We need to live within our environmental means. And it will be the low carbon and the resource efficient that will inherit the future. Second, we need to help build the green economy of tomorrow as we respond to the economic crisis of today. The London summit of G20 leaders saw agreement on putting money into the green economy. South Korea has led the way with its green plan. Here in the US, the fiscal stimulus passed by Congress is going to provide a huge boost to the renewables industry. And in the UK, we've provided an additional $2.3 billion for the low-carbon sector. We're investing in waste into energy through anaerobic digestion. We're building new flood defences to protect communities. And in March, I had the rare opportunity to create a new national park, 60 years after the legislation was passed by our Parliament to create the first national park. But this is just the start. Our goal must be to make every building energy efficient, all our transport sustainable, all our energy clean or renewable, and all our agriculture sustainable and productive. Third, to do this, we have to change incentives in our economies. For how else will we make investment change course so we can meet demand with fewer resources? We will need regulation, like new product standards. We will need financial incentives, like our landfill levy, which has resulted in a big increase in recycling in Britain. And we will need encouragement, people making the change themselves in their own lives. Fourth, we must seize the opportunities and create the jobs that this new era will open up. We'll need engineers to build the wave and wind turbines and the anaerobic digesters. We'll need agronomists to help farmers walk their land with a lower carbon footprint. We'll need auto workers to make electric cars and consumers to buy them. We'll need scientists to combat new and changing diseases. We'll need landfill miners who will dig for precious raw materials in what we used to call waste. Fifth, the world needs to come together to deal with our lack of water, the damaging loss of biodiversity, and the challenge of producing enough food. The World Food Programme, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and others need to respond to crises and support the investment that will secure supplies in the long term. The Global Partnership for Agriculture and Food Security, which the UK strongly supports, an initiative of the Secretary-General, is the best way to do this. But more than anything else, farmers need markets, people with money to buy what they produce. And therefore, getting the Doha deal done would be one of the most important steps we could take. Sixth, and I suppose in part the reason that I am here, is that we need America to apply all of its great energy to the task we together face. And we need you to lead. President Obama's commitment on climate change is the best hope we have of reaching an agreement in Copenhagen. At the UNEP meeting in Kenya in February this year, 9 years of failure to deal with mercury was transformed by America's new direction. And the 2010 UN Biodiversity Conference will need you too. And the message we hear is loud and it is clear. America is back. And that gives us confidence. Because above all, we need confidence in ourselves and in our ability to do all this. The politics of climate change and environmental degradation may not be new, but the world today is smaller than it's ever been. We're more interconnected than ever before. The problems of finance and health and environment of one nation are the concern of all nations. And we need to bring new leadership to bear if we are to build our sustainable world. Now, there are many ties that bind our two countries together. In my case, my father was from London and my mother was from Cincinnati. And I hope that our response to this crisis will forge new bonds. And by a quirk of history, a coincidence of 2 centuries ago, there is an old bond that unites us still. On the 12th of February 1809, 2 babies were born. One in a log cabin in Kentucky, and the other on an English country estate. These 2 children would never meet, but each changed the way in which we see society, the way we see the world, and the way we see ourselves. Each challenged the assumptions of his day, and each became an enduring symbol of the quest for truth and reason. Their names were, of course, Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin. An American dedicated to a new birth of freedom, an Englishman to the birth of a new science, so forming, as Adam Gopnik argues in his book about these 2 great parallel lives, the twin pillars on which our societies now rest. And as we confront the great questions of our time, we would do well to remember what Darwin's painstaking research taught him, and us. He wrote, "It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent. It is the one that is most adaptable to change." Well, change is coming. We must adapt. It is the challenge to which our generation must rise, and the time to start doing so is now. Thank you very much.
We have, I guess the message was change we can believe in, and that was.
Never heard that before.
Yeah, that was. It wasn't Robert Malthus. It was pretty optimistic. So let's open it up now for questions and discussion from the floor. We have about 20 minutes. Please identify yourself and your affiliation. Thank you. This gentleman here.
Hi, I'm Paul Bartell from the Humanitarian Information Unit at the Department of State. I have 2 questions. The first one may be provocative, but you mentioned providing incentives for sustainable agriculture. And so I was wondering how you differentiate that from subsidies. And the second question is, as we look at these implementation of energy efficiencies and the incentives necessary to do that, it's rather conceivable that it can be done in the larger economies, but I was wondering how you would suggest doing that in emerging economies.
Yeah. Paul, thanks very much indeed. I hope you don't mind if I'm familiar. You can call me what you like in return. That's always the deal. I think what's happening in Europe is an example of how the shift from subsidy to incentive has been taking place. You go back 30 years ago, Europe was spending 80% of its budget on agriculture and agricultural subsidy. It's now 43%. There's been a process of reform, and we've tried to shift money from what's known as Pillar 1, the subsidy bit, to Pillar 2, which is supporting the environmental schemes that I was talking about. Because in the end, the market should support and provide for the cost of production, but the environmental benefits, as I said, are not yet properly taken account of in the way in which our markets work, which is why the work of the Tea Project to get us to understand the economic benefit is so important, because it seems to me that's one of the ways in which you can shift our understanding of of what are the true incentives in our society. So, bluntly, it depends where you put the money and how you give it. On energy, you put your finger on a very, very big question. Let's take coal. Now, 40% of the population of India have none of this. They don't have electricity currently. You know, we take it for granted. It's an important engine of economic growth as well as an aid to a better life. And India burns a lot of coal. Now, we have a particular responsibility to develop the new technologies that will enable us to decarbonise electricity generation from coal, carbon capture and storage. My cabinet colleague Ed Miliband made an announcement recently about the policy we will apply to any new coal-fired power stations in the UK, saying that none will be able to build unless they have, in part, carbon capture and storage applying from the very beginning. Now, why do we need to do that? Fundamentally, because unless we can develop this technology on a commercial scale, it's hard to see how we're going to achieve the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions we need in the world, because so much coal is burnt to produce so much electricity. And once the technology is up and running, there's a market opportunity for people to sell it to other folk. There's a chance for other countries to fit it to their power stations. But then is the tricky question of who's going to pay. And that's why the deal in Copenhagen, I've long been of the view, is a combination of commitments, undertakings, actions, whatever name you give to them, from all of the countries of the world, and we need contributions from everywhere, because contributions from the rich countries won't be enough given the concentration of greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere and the rising emissions from the emerging and developing economies, and in return finance to help pay for the cost of movement in a low carbon direction. And the final point I'd make is that in our societies we need better to reconnect ourselves with where our energy comes from. And that's why we have recently legislated in the UK to introduce feed-in tariffs, following the example of other European countries, where for micro-generation you can get a guaranteed price for any electricity that's surplus that you sell back to the grid. And when you do that, then the debate about having renewable energy in the midst of your community turns from our companies turning up and telling us we're going to have a turbine in the middle of our town to we're going to put it up, it's going to help generate some of our energy, and we're going to make some money from selling it back to the grid. And in a stroke, you have transformed the relationship, because in the end, the energy's got to come from somewhere.
Thank you. Yes, Harry Blaney.
Harry Blaney.
Microphone, Harry.
Yeah, sorry. Harry Blaney, Center for International Policy. I have a two-part question. One relates to what you just said a little bit about before, but only briefly, and that is, what is the deal that will need to be made to get, the developed world to agree to an extension, if you would, of the climate change efforts, and what for the developing world is needed to get them on board? Because, as you know, one of the unfortunate debates here in the United States is over the issue of we won't join unless the developing world joins. And what is the deal that will bring both China, India et al. On board, and bring also the United States and EU and Russia and Australia? And I won't have to go through the rest, you know, only too well. And the other one is a different one. It's a little bit related, and that is, what do you see as the largest obstacles that are in the way of a true agreement, in addition to the question I just raised, to a deal in Copenhagen that will work and be effective, not be just paced over statements, but something that will in fact find agreement in the end? Is it indeed American leadership alone, or is it more than that? Is it EU leadership? Is it somehow agreement by Russia and India and China? Thank you.
Harry, thanks. Well, to answer the second one first, it's the absence of political will that will be the biggest obstacle, and it's the application of political will that will make it possible. Let's tell the truth. In every country in the world, the conversation about climate change goes like this. Yeah, we get the science. And then the other half of the conversation is, but we're a bit worried about the implications of doing something about climate change for our economy. From the richest nations to the very poorest, who say, is this going to undermine our development? Will it mean that I can't bring electricity to more of my citizens, that people's lives won't improve, that they won't have better incomes to look after their children, feed them, afford healthcare, get them into school? We all face the same problem. That's the first thing. Secondly, there are no countries in the world that don't get it. I don't believe that. And if you're China and you look at your coastal cities and you then contemplate sea level rise, well, you've got a bit of a problem coming. And if you're India and Bangladesh is next door, and most of Bangladesh lives not very far above sea level, and sea level rise comes, Bangladesh is moving house. Who's going to provide a home for 140 million people? I was talking with Tom Vilsack this morning over breakfast, and he was describing to me the impact that the pine bark beetle is having in Colorado, killing the trees. Now, that really brings it home to us. We see some similar problems emerging in the UK with a form of fungus that is affecting our oak trees and our beech trees and our horse chestnuts. Now, if you say to people in Britain, you know, what is your picture of the English countryside that we love? Well, it's the rolling fields and the hills and the green grass and the oak trees. And if you say, well, a changing climate may sound not a lot, 2-3 degree increase in temperature, but it's going to change the very countryside that we love, then people begin to see the impact of this. And it seems to me understanding the impact and what we can do to mitigate that is fundamental to moving the politics on. And if I just take the example of the UK, we've moved, in the space of 10 years from discussion about climate being the preserve of environmental NGOs and others and some scientists, to it being smack in the middle of our politics. We've just passed the Climate Change Act. First country in the world to do that. We're the first country in the world to have a carbon budget. And the government, having adopted the budget along with the money budget about a month ago, is about to publish its plan in the summer for how we're going to deliver on that budget. Now, how did that happen? Because the science became clearer. People from below said, government, what are you going to do about it? And political leadership said, OK, this is what we're going to do about it. And it's not there's nothing special about Britain in that respect. That's the way in which politics, it seems to me, has moved it on. And it's not just about America, but I think the change that has taken place is hugely significant because, understandably, a lot of people look at the largest economy in the world and say, well, what's your contribution going to be? I think the hardest thing is the fact that we can't do it without a contribution from the developing and emerging economies. Because the science tells us this. If by some magic power we could stop emitting in the rich and developed world tomorrow morning, America stops emitting any greenhouse gases, European Union, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and other countries, we're still left with a problem because of the concentration already there in the atmosphere and the rising emissions. That's the truth. And everybody knows that. But I think the basic element of the deal is, as I described in answer to the previous question, finance to help unlock undertakings. And in the end, someone keeps score because you can go around the table and say, what are you in for? Right, United States, Europe, China, India. Right, okay, well, that's where we're going to be in 2050. This is what the science tells us about the kind of temperature increase that we're heading for. Everyone happy with that? Not happy? Well, then we need a bit more. I mean, that's the problem that we've got to address.
This gentleman in the middle there.
My name is James Stapper. I'm a social science student. I'm currently an adjunct professor at Australia University and a former ambassador of Liberia to Nigeria. And I find it interesting that your approach has a one side, know it, and has the answer approach. There is the third world out there that is not included in the global thinking. You start to talk about markets And in the last few weeks, we've seen that the markets are not as invulnerable as they have been projected to be. We see a lot of unemployment, people without incomes and so forth. How do they survive in a world in which markets have failed? So you go back to the foundation of government and its role as a key player, both in the so-called developed world and the developing world. So there seems to me to talk in terms of partnership, both public and private as a basis. And then we find answers together. One of the difficulties we have from the African perspective in dealing with Europeans is that it's a colonial relationship which you have taken for granted as being a way of life that should be maintained. And so there's not a great deal of mutual respect and trust around the room. And so Mr. Obama's coming to office has changed the dimension of discussion so that we can give each other the benefit of the doubt to think together. Not to say, we've decided this, what will the market pay, we proceed. You can't proceed anywhere without taking into consideration the other point of view and their input. Thank you.
I agree with everything you've just said. And this is not about one bit of the world saying, we've got it worked out, would you please do what we tell you to do? After all, who got the impact of climate change first? It is developing countries already experiencing it. Already, where rainfall is less than it was, seeing the changes taking place. And it's absolutely not about us instructing each other to do this. It's about us recognising the common problem that we've got and finding a common solution. First point. Secondly, I agree with you. It's got to be a combination of the market and government action. There are some things that only governments can do. If you think about what farmers need in order, let's say, to produce more food, first of all, you need to feel secure on the land. If you don't feel secure on the land, well, you're less likely to invest in improving it and producing as much as possible than if you do feel secure. Now, that's to do with governance and the way in which land is distributed, title. You need credit so that you can buy improved seeds, make more selective use of fertilizer. You need better transport. One of the reasons that fertilizer is astonishingly expensive in parts of Africa is it costs a fortune to actually get it to the farmers. So better transport works to reduce the price coming in and to get the goods to market quicker going out. Less food rots in some countries because of transport problems and storage problems. The food that's being produced today is inedible before it gets near anybody's mouth. You need irrigation schemes and you need a market. You need something to produce for. And you're right, the relationship that we have had when it comes to world trade has been an uneven and an unfair one, and that's why I said what I said about Doha. Because one thing we could do as the world that has been subsidising agriculture and then dumping what we didn't need on developing country markets is to stop doing that, because then that will give farmers in those markets a better chance of growing food and earning a living.
Afraid we'll have to make this the last question. This gentleman here. Wait for the microphone, please. Yeah.
Daniel Amod,
Daniel, sorry.
Investment firm. I have a question regarding who do you see, or what institution do you see as being the ombudsman or the impartial judge of where the resources are being applied? For example, countries now that have the military power can go ahead and grab resources, and countries that have the economic power can go ahead and buy the resources. And just recently, the president of Russia said that he expected to see a resource war, oil-related or gas-related, within the next 10 years. So given that you have powerful nations that are set in at least maintaining their standard of living, and the cost of that to the current environment, what institution or how do you see the world body moving to make sure that everybody in the world gets an equal piece of the pie, essentially?
Thank you. It's a very good and a very challenging question indeed. I mean, I'd say the first thing that we've got to do is to try and maximise the use of the resources that we do have. And that's a responsibility on every nation. So to garner and care for the water that we have got, and if it's raining more in the winter and less in the summer, how do you hang on to it and use it when you need it? To try and develop as much security as you can as far as energy use is concerned, because if you want to think about the consequences of being dependent on somebody else for your energy, and I know it's been one of the very powerful arguments that President Obama has made here, but just ask one or two countries in Europe what it feels like when someone else's hand turns the gas tap off. And we've seen that in the last 2 years. I think it's going to be a big challenge for the international system, because we have developed structures in place for dealing with some of the consequences of the problems we've had to deal with in the past and the present, the way we deal with refugees fleeing conflict. We have UNHCR, which turns up and says, OK, we're going to look after you, now you've come over the border to us. But a big question will be, looking forward, how are we going to deal with environmental refugees? Because that will be the most immediate consequence. If there is an inequitable distribution of resources, if people can't survive where they're living, well, they're going to go somewhere else. And I think the international system will have to start thinking about, you know, what the rules are going to be and how we're going to find the finance to support people. In the end, it's a very, very powerful argument for us taking responsibility for helping countries to develop in a sustainable way. Because we have a very basic choice. Either we can say, OK, we'll just look after ourselves. We'll shut the door, we're fine, we just won't worry about the rest of the world. And yet we know that in the end, what happens in the rest of the world is going to impact upon us. It's a very fundamental choice for the world as we carry on down the course of the 21st century. Either we acknowledge our interdependence and use the institutions that we have fashioned to try and resolve the difficult questions that you have raised, or it's every man and woman and country for him or herself. And it's pretty clear that we've got to do the former and not the latter.
Well, thank you very much. For those who had questions we couldn't get to, I'm sorry, but Mr. Benn is on a tight schedule and has to press on. Really been treated today to an outstanding tour d'horizon of issues, and the note that he closed on, quoting from Darwin about adaptability, does have with it a underlying message of hope that these issues are not totally intractable and beyond our ability to devise prudent public policies to address the challenges he laid out in his remarks today. So please join me in thanking Mr. Benn for an outstanding presentation.
Thank you very much.